Once our recruit had been rated, they would quickly learn that their entire purpose was to keep the ship moving, handling the lines, managing the sails. Everything was done to serve the ship. And it would be on-the-job training. They would be expected to get to grips with everything and fast.
If you're a deckhand, you need to be able to do everything.
Okay.
If someone's injured, someone becomes ill, everyone needs to have the skills. So
You need to learn the ropes.
Absolutely, yeah. So even if it's a case of when we had greener crew members, you have to get them up. They don't know what they're doing, and you have to talk them through it, and it's pretty miserable for them because it's windy and it's cold, and you're stood on one bit of rope and it's not pleasant, but you've got to expose them to it.
As well as learning the ropes, our recruit would have to learn the rhythms of life on board one of His Britannic Majesty's ships. Life that started pretty early. At 5 a.m. came the piercing scream of the boatswain's whistles. These tough characters moved through the ship, telling everyone that it was time to get up. All hands up, ahoy! Then they came along with their knives and shouted, out or down, that's the word. And if you're still in your hammock, they'd cut the rope here and send you crashing to the deck. You were expected to stow your hammock, take it up to the deck and place it in the netting that surrounded the rails of the ship. And then it was time to give the ship a good clean. Every single day, the ship's routine started with a thorough clean. Cleanliness was next to godliness in the Royal Navy of Nelson's time. In fact, Napoleon found himself a prisoner of the Royal Navy in 1815 after the Battle of Waterloo, and he commented, as did many, many foreign visitors, on how British ships were spotless. So the entire crew would have set to work scrubbing, brushing, swabbing the decks every single morning. There would have been a lot on those decks. The pitch and tar would have come off the rig. The animals that were kept aboard for fresh produce would have had their droppings all over the ship. And of course there were hundreds of men living aboard, so they needed a good scrub. And that was one of the ways in which the Royal Navy kept incidents of disease in these tightly packed communities down. So they would have washed the decks down. Then they used these holy stones, basically bits of sandstone, and sort of sand the deck down, take a top layer of muck off it, and then you get your brushes or your swabs made of old rope, and wash that over the side. Looking very clean, that stretch of deck now, if you don't mind me saying. After a hard morning of swabbing, our recruit would have earned themselves a spot of breakfast. Now, contrary to the myth, sailors in Nelson's Navy actually ate pretty well. The Navy looked after its seamen. They had to, because they had to have the strength and the morale to sail and fight these enormous ships. Particularly given the diet in the Georgian slums at the time. Sailors would have been very excited to have meat 4 days a week. On Saturdays, they had this, 2 pounds of salt beef. Now this looks slightly more appetising than it would have looked back in the early 19th century. There the beef would have been packed into casks, perhaps for years on end, covered in salt to preserve it, and be so hard it was almost said to be like a piece of wood that you could varnish. Still, what a treat. You'd eat that alongside the carbohydrates, the famous ship's biscuits. These are baked hard in special naval facilities around Britain. They too could be packed in casks and transported over huge distances before they just fell apart. Even so, there are some legendary stories about just how hard and disgusting these got. The ship's cook cooked for the men, the ordinary and able seamen. The officers had their own cooks, their own supplies. They ate very well, thank you, back there at the stern of the ship. He'd take a great big vat, he'd pour in some meat, he'd pour in old bits of biscuit, and he'd create these kind of stews. There was a weird sort of slush that rose to the surface that he could skim off and do with it what he will. It was a perk of the job. You could sell them to rope makers, for example, to make them more resistant to wind and weather. The cook benefited from what was known as the slush fund. So this was on high days and holidays, but 3 days a week, it was no meat for you. Instead it was oatmeal, about half a pint of peas, and then equally dispersed amount of cheese, butter and sugar. It's said by modern nutritionists that the naval diet of the Georgian Navy gave seafarers about 5,000 calories a day, which is what you'd expect for young men doing a huge amount of heavy lifting. And all of that, of course, had to be washed down with something. Beer. Now again, the myth here is that the Navy drank nothing but grog, rum mixed with water and a bit of lemon juice. But in fact, beer was the staple drink. It wasn't the kind of full-strength beer we get nowadays. It's thought to be a little bit weaker, small beer. But they had a gallon a day. Now that wasn't quite as insane as it sounds, because our beer was probably better for you than most drinking water, which could have been pulled out of the Thames or somewhere like that. The brewing process meant that many of the microbes, many of the nasty diseases were killed off. And so beer stored in casks might keep the crew healthier than drinking water. Of course, when the beer ran out, that's when you had to turn to the local tipple. If your ship was serving in the Mediterranean, you might take arak or wine, which needed a lot of watering down. If you were in the Caribbean, well, you're near the sugar plantations, and that meant rum, the famous grog. That was about 4 parts water to 1 part rum, lemon juice added to keep the scurvy away, and a bit of brown sugar as well. It should be said, predictably, that sailors were world-leading experts in smuggling their own supplies of booze aboard ship. Captains would supplement this basic diet wherever they could. They knew that a well-fed crew was likely to be a happy and effective crew. Nelson's letters are full of accounts of him trying to find decent food, drinks, water for his men, keep their health in good shape. And that meant captains started experimenting in the 18th century and early 19th, particularly when it came to scurvy, a disease they didn't quite realise caused by deficiency of vitamin C that led to complete debilitation and death. One way of dealing with scurvy was very unpopular. Sauerkraut, kept a long time, full of vitamin C, a superfood. A little more popular, the lemon, replaced by limes later in the 19th century, but a very reliable way of keeping scurvy at bay. The Admiralty declared that when it came to food and drink, the sailors should be given the best of everything. Now, I think it would be quite a stretch to claim this was the best that Georgian Britain could offer, but certainly, compared to their peers on land or in other industries, the sailors of Nelson's Navy were pretty well looked after. Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel, which we are relaunching. We've got all the best exclusive content going straight onto this History Hit YouTube channel, and you can find out, for example, why on earth I'm standing at the top of this mast. You should probably subscribe.